Welcome to the Global Businesswomen's Pod, brought to you by the Greater Houston Women's Chamber of Commerce. I am Susan Dyson and proud to be the CEO, President, and founder of the Chamber. Please join us for this empowering podcast every Thursday at 6 p.m.
Howdy, Health Explained listeners. This is Dr. Robbyn Traylor. I am your host and Chief Medical Officer of Acute Care Services at Next Level Urgent Care. Today we are going to be talking about vaccines, why they matter, where they came from, and who's supposed to get them. I am thrilled to have two of my Next Level besties in the room with us today. Dr. Martin Kus, our Chief Medical Officer of Occupational Medicine. Say hi, Martin.
Hello, Dr. Traylor. Good morning.
And Dr. Karen Rakers, who is our Chief Medical Officer of Next Level Health and Wellness. Howdy, Karen.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Yes. Well, we are recording on Valentine's Day, and I gave a talk last year and informed people that in my mind, vaccines and the act of becoming vaccinated is an act of love, because we don't get vaccinated just for ourselves, right? I mean, it's a public health initiative, and when we vaccinate ourselves, we are protecting the weakest, the smallest, the immunocompromised among us.
Spread love, not germs.
That's what I'm saying, Dr. Rakers.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that if you vaccinate, like there's a magic number, it's like 85% or something like that. If you vaccinate that,
Yes.
everybody else is protected
The
too.
herd immunity.
Exactly.
Yes,
You're affecting
absolutely.
it's all about the herd.
So, right, it's all about the herd. You got to do what the herd needs, okay? So I don't remember in medical school or even in undergraduate studies learning exactly where vaccines came from. Vaccines have always been around our entire lives. I mean, some of them are new, right? Since we've grown, there have been some new introductions on the scene, and we'll get to that part. But vaccination as a concept has always been with us. And I wondered, well, how far back does this even go? There's a guy from England in the 1700s named Edward Jenner, I believe, and he is known as the father of vaccination because of big strides he made during a smallpox outbreak. Apparently, he had heard that milkmaids were immune to smallpox. Mm-hmm. And why? Like, honestly, why would milkmaids not get the thing? And so he bravely would take a small sample of smallpox pus from like a person and then inject it in another person. And suddenly, somehow, these people were protected from the smallpox virus. And you wonder, like, where did that guy even get the idea to do that?
Is that the way it worked? I thought it was you give it to the cow, and then the cow makes antibodies, and then you inoculate it from the cow. I may be remembering it incorrectly.
Well, maybe not. Okay, this is what I'm saying. They didn't teach us in school. I got it off of Google, Martin, so you could be 100% right about that. You know, punchline is, though, that the world had been inoculating humans for hundreds of years before Jenner's paper was published in England. There are journals in China and in Africa and all over the world explaining how to inoculate individuals in times of pestilence and disease, you know, in order to protect society. And interestingly, even here in the States and in the early colonies in the 1700s, an enslaved person taught the dominant class how to inoculate people against smallpox so that many people would have their lives spared during the smallpox outbreak in New England in the early 1700s. So I'm saying this is not new. Like, vaccination as a concept has been on the planet for a very long time.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
I remember hearing about polio and how polio was a big, big deal. And then what they did is they put it on sugar cubes.
Okay.
Is that what they did?
I mean, I would eat that.
When the
Yeah.
well, that's why it's an oral. That's the oral version that we have now. And I think what I remember is people would line up for just long lines, and then in that big public health effort, at that one time, almost eradicated polio from Earth.
They give them in schools too.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that concept came back around early in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. Some people wanted to rely on that ancient wisdom that maybe being around, someone with the virus might help you pick it up and then develop some kind of natural immunity to the virus. And I wouldn't say that logic was totally flawed, but I would argue that getting the actual COVID vaccine is safer and more effective, more controlled than, rolling the dice and maybe just trying to put yourself in front of what could be a catastrophic,
Well, and I think really
illness,
that is the concept that we all believe in when it comes to vaccines in general. We want to get the vaccine that we know, what's in it and what the response is going to be based upon data, not get the actual disease, which, can be deadly.
Yeah,
100%.
exactly right. Yeah, no, one thing we know for sure, the vaccine did not kill people, whereas real COVID at times did.
Oh, right, absolutely. And what we learned with COVID, at least early on in COVID with the Alpha and maybe even with the Delta, is that it was 10 times the killer as influenza. And I know you guys remember our ICUs were flooded, our hospitals were flooded, our emergency rooms were flooded. We had lines wrapped around our urgent care buildings at that time. Remember when we were wearing the raincoats?
I do.
Yes.
And we have to wash them after every use. You have to spray them down.
Let them dry.
We were wearing
You have to let
raincoats
it
and we
dry.
would go out in the parking lot to swab people for COVID because we didn't know what it was. This is before we had a vaccine, and we were just trying to keep everyone safe. And so, boom, at the end of 2020 when the first vaccine comes out?
It was December of 2020 because
Moderna
we were all
came
here.
first and Pfizer came next, or something like
And
that.
actually,
We got our Moderna, I think, on
It was
December
like
23rd.
December
So-
23rd.
because
and
we all
started
showed up and we
vaccinating
got our
on the
own
24th.
vaccines.
Oh
Yep.
my goodness.
I remember when Dr. Rakers got her vaccine. I remember her husband getting her vaccine. Dr. Breeze.
Yes.
So we were kind of a hub here. Remember, we got the first
Yes.
batch, and all of the healthcare providers from the whole region
Yes.
would drive in from like all over Louisiana. and-
Yes.
December
Well,
24th.
it was
That day
hard to
was
get
my
the
most
stuff.
favorite day as a doctor ever, giving vaccination to
100%.
people who were healthcare workers and high risk and really needed
Special.
For the
protection.
first time in my career, I actually did feel a little bit like a hero, okay? Because we were on the front lines. By that point, we had already been testing and trying to treat people for COVID, but now we had the vaccine and we were going to be able to make it available to, the elderly and people with comorbidities, the really vulnerable and frontline healthcare workers.
Yeah.
So we were desperate for it at the time. I know some of us had some questions about what in the world this vaccine was, this mRNA vaccine, where did it come from? Mm-hmm. And at Next Level, during the COVID pandemic, we established the clinical research department. So we got to be involved in some of those early immunotherapy trials that were very good and quite effective at the time. That stuff doesn't work so well anymore. But we had some comfort with understanding like immunotherapy, and then when the vaccine came out, it seemed like an obvious and wonderful kind of preventive step, because at the time, I don't know if you guys remember, we were giving the immunotherapy, the monoclonal antibody, as a prophylactic to high-risk individuals who had COVID in the home.
Yep, exposure.
But okay, so let's talk about mRNA vaccine. Ooh, another fun fact that I learned last year when I gave the vaccine talk. Y'all, a woman scientist in the 1970s discovered the mRNA vector as a vaccine. And I thought that was kind of cool. And her idea gained some traction and, developed some weight in scientific community. But by then, we had all these other formulas for vaccine, right? Live attenuated and inactivated and, all these other kinds. And so I think that by the time mRNA came around, the world just didn't feel like we actually needed mRNA, but it wound up being our saving grace during the COVID pandemic.
I spoke a little bit about this in one of my talks that I gave, and what I learned during that talk is that you're right, that technology and that research has been around forever. The problem is we didn't have a vector to use it against because there was nothing that was a good fit for it. It's cool because the COVID particle, or that little
spike protein.
You're right. The spike
Yeah.
protein is like the only thing accessible on this tiny little particle.
Right.
And remember, it looks like a snowball kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah.
And so
Very
really,
scary snowball.
no
Yes.
other. I mean, viruses are really like the only and the best kind of tool to target with using that mRNA vaccine. And so really, that was the first time we had the opportunity to use it. It really doesn't work on other things for now.
Totally. Well, it was a smart shot. So
Excellent
what
shot.
I learned is that the mRNA vaccine is actually a message. It's a code. It's a recipe.
The plasmid, yeah.
Yeah, right. And so in the analogy that I like to tell, because it made sense to me, you can call me simple-minded if you want to, but it made sense to me. You give your body a shot of the recipe, and then your body bakes the cake, okay? And the cake is the spike protein from COVID.
Exactly.
So the shot tells your body how to create that spike protein, and then your immune system goes, wait a minute, that guy's not supposed to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And your immune system attacks.
Antibodies.
Yeah, and your immune system goes to eat the cake. There you go.
And there were
So
two
you get the recipe, you bake
I
the
love
cake, you eat
it.
the cake, and now you
brilliant.
remember. I know. Sometimes I think I'm very brilliant, Dr. Rakers, but
We should eat cake on
I'm
Valentine's Day.
telling you, today is the day for cake and chocolate and all kinds of sweet goods. We're talking about sugar cubes, for goodness sakes.
I think that this was fascinating because we did the mRNA side, but there was a DNA side to this too. So you could either give somebody DNA and then they would make their own mRNA
That's
and
right.
then develop the spike protein, or give them the mRNA directly.
That's
the cool
right.
thing about this is that you actually infect one of your muscle cells, or a few of them,
Yeah.
with the actual thing, and then that's why. Do you remember how sore our arms were?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Because your body's attacking that muscle cell, and that muscle cell will be destroyed for the benefit of the
Oh my
whole
gosh.
body.
Of
It's
the
almost
body.
like the vaccine
I
concept
could
all
not
over
raise
again.
my arm. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I remember looking at some of our other colleagues that I gave shots to feeling bad. It's like I punched them in the arm when I gave them the shot, but
So
Well,
would
people
ask-
get worried about things like that, but all those side effects that happen are really just your body doing what we want it to do, which is to form and mount an immune response so that you have protection in the future. So the sore arm, the low grade fever, the body aches,
It was almost
it's all
reassuring to
what we
tell-
want to happen.
People liked hearing about that. They liked when it would explain to them that they actually had the spike protein in their arm. It reassured them that, so I'm not getting it all over my body. It's like, exactly, you're not. And, well, can I test positive from it? Well, no, because it's only in your arm.
yes, that was a big,
Yeah.
big myth at the time, and understandably so, because COVID was new. No one knew where it came from. There was some skepticism about research and the clinical science community. And I think it's healthy to ask questions. But the truth is that, number one, the shot is not COVID. You're not giving yourself COVID, okay? Any risk of side effect is so minuscule. At one time we were worried about blood clots, and I think the risk of blood clots from the Johnson & Johnson shot in particular was less than 1/10,000%. It was so ridiculously low compared to the actual risk of blood clots with COVID and other things. And so, in our work, I know that we found ourselves in front of patients and maybe even some of our family and friends really trying to advocate for the efficacy and the safety of that actual COVID shot. Well, now it's 3 years later, going on, 4 years later, and I think people are a lot more comfortable with the COVID shot than we were 3 years ago. It's almost ubiquitous. No one really cares about it anymore.
I think people get, nervous about potential side effects. Again, side effects or complications. And, as a physician, I always tell people there's a risk of everything you do, but also definitely anything that you put inside of your body. And what we do is we weigh the risks versus the benefits. And I think it's interesting because people, kind of lose sight of the fact that like taking Tylenol has risk. All these things that people do on a regular basis, over-the-counter medications. I mean, walking across the street, we take risk in everything that we do. And so there's, a vaccine, there is going to be some minuscule risk to anything that you put in your body. But
there's actually, so we do have absolute contraindications of the vaccine, and those absolute contraindications are anaphylaxis. So if you've had anaphylaxis, true anaphylaxis with the first shot, you probably shouldn't get the second shot. But otherwise, that risk for the Moderna vaccine, it was 2 to 5 per million. It was 2-5. They weren't sure, somewhere in there. And the Pfizer was 5 to 7 per million. So absolutely tiny amount. So much so that when they had these huge drive-by parties in LA, where everybody would just drive by and they would have just hundreds of medical personnel, they wouldn't sing a single case for the whole day. So it's truly, truly extremely rare, and that's the only absolute contraindication.
Right. So COVID shot's a good shot. It's pretty safe. I don't know which booster I'm on. I've probably had 4 or 5 COVID shots in my arm. I have no idea where I even am anymore. I've lost count. But so I started out talking about how when we're children, we get plenty of shots. I mean, if you are a primary care doctor taking care of infants, probably at that 2-month visit, that baby's getting like 4 shots. Right at birth, babies are getting the Hep B vaccine. That's right. So let's talk a little bit about like our vaccine timeline throughout our lives. What are we getting? What is this stuff? What are we protected from? What's the deal?
Well, all kinds of things as a child, right? We get hepatitis B, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, hepatitis A a little bit later, MMR varicella a little bit later, Haemophilus influenza, pneumococcal. There's a bunch, right, when you're little. As a baby, that newborn vaccine series that kind of ends around age 4 to 6 when you kind of complete your childhood vaccination series. And kids do get, a good number of vaccines, which is awesome because then they don't have to get sick with all the things that we all had to suffer with.
And I have to say, our generation really doesn't have a whole lot of exposure to the devastation of the viruses that we are protected against. I mean, some kids would get like measles and just die, or goodness, polio was terrible, in like the mid 1900s. Our children became lame and couldn't walk and got weak, and this is just not even something we even see anymore because of the efficacy and safety of the vaccines.
Some vaccines are being phased out. The BCG vaccine, I think it's still pretty effective, 86%. But even so, because it's so effective that we really don't have to use it in the States, for example.
We haven't used that in the States.
Right. Well, I mean, I call that a big win for humankind that we discovered that. And I also think that it is important for society to protect its members against those kinds of devastating illness. We just should not have to deal with measles and polio and rubella and Haemophilus influenza B, for goodness sakes, And so, at schools there are vaccine mandates. Now I'm a family doctor. Of course, I'm pro-vaccine. I think everybody should get their shots, should not miss one. I think we should all be first in line to get our shots. I don't think that there should be any skipping of vaccines. For a while there, some people were worried about vaccine linked to autism. That turned out to be completely false. Well, I mean, there was never any real science to support that claim, but it's a really scary thing to say, and I think any loving parent or grandparent might pause if they heard a bad rumor, about that shot. But
they still do.
Right. Well, this is what I'm saying. But
in California.
Right. So, we're all of us in this room are parents, and have immunized ourselves and our children and encourage our families to get immunized. But I think some people are under the false assumption that by the time you get to kindergarten, or maybe even after you get that last tetanus booster in 9th grade, you're good. No more shots in your life. And that's not necessarily true.
That's not true, for sure.
We had actually mentioned that. So there's You all see two versions of this. I see three. So the second one for me is, so you have the childhood ones and you have the military ones.
Oh, there you
Talk
go.
about the military ones for
Your
a second.
anthrax vaccine, which
Yeah, you guys get all kinds
the
of
anthrax one was pretty cool. You get 6 shots in the first year, and then afterwards it's a yearly booster,
you kidding?
and it only lasts for 1 year. So if you don't boost yourself, you're no longer protected. Fortunately, anthrax is very easy to treat. And then we do the smallpox vaccine, which is not necessary for everyone in the United States anymore. Other countries still do it because, actually, I don't know if it's necessary anywhere because it has been eradicated, technically speaking.
Yeah.
But the most important ones that I think people overlook and kind of forget about are the ones that we should get. I'm getting to that age.
We're getting to that age.
Yeah,
Well, let's skip to the adolescents first, because I think you're right. Babies get their vaccine series, and then they think, oh man, I'm good. Now, the adolescents is a little bit easier because schools often do require these vaccinations. But, the 11 to 12-year-olds have recommendations for meningitis vaccination, HPV vaccination.
Which
What an
is
amazing vaccine.
What a blessing. I can't call it anything other than that. I mean, the idea that something like 70 to 80% of women, 70 to 80% of women in the world are going to be exposed to human papillomavirus. And that virus causes cancer. Women die. I had a patient in medical school that died mid-20s of cervical cancer. Horrible, right? Yes. Now you got a shot that can prevent cervical cancer. Yes. Incredible. Yeah.
I know. It's amazing. So and so they get those two, and then they also have a recommendation at that age group to get a tetanus and whooping cough booster, which that's kind of the adolescent series. But yes, Dr. Kus, as we get even a little bit older, people really start forgetting that they might need some vaccination. And I think 50 and up shingles vaccines. We've got 65 and up routinely get pneumonia vaccination. Everybody every year should continue to get a flu shot. You should continue to get a tetanus vaccine every 10 years, and actually as an adult get a whooping cough booster if you haven't had one. So we want to protect, the whooping cough one I think has been interesting because we've seen, again, outbreaks of that, pop up, at different times across the country, just really due to probably people not having as high a rate of vaccination as we would like. And so that recommendation to get an adult booster of that vaccine came about in more recent, years, like during our careers.
As opposed to like measles, which is easy to see, the whooping cough one, it can kind of go underlying, and you can get a whole population or whole community sick, and they don't even know it because it's just the whooping cough until it becomes very severe.
Well, and I think what happens, it's not a severe illness often in adults, so we have a cough, and then you're around a baby, a newborn, someone who's younger, immunocompromised, and they actually
that Sealy barky cough,
extremely ill.
It's terrifying. It's terrifying. I actually worked a pertussis outbreak in residency, and it's horrible, to watch the community be affected, by that particular illness. Well, and it's not, that's just the thing, like, it's just so unnecessary. If we go ahead and get our shots, we can prevent ourselves a lot of pain and sickness. And so, how are we going to wrap this up, y'all? It's Valentine's Day. What is like a parting thought, any kind of guiding wisdom that we would give to our friends and neighbors and our patients about vaccinations? What if people don't know their vaccine status? They lost their shot records forever ago. They haven't even thought about it. Like, how do we figure that out?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of the childhood vaccinations, by the time you reach adulthood, you would not be, really wanting to repeat any of those. Some of them you would, but a lot of those, if we did want to repeat, you can actually have titers checked. So you can go have a blood test to see if you are, in fact, immune to certain conditions or not, and then determine whether you might be eligible or be able to benefit from getting vaccinated for those things as an adult. And otherwise, if you really don't know, for example, if you're old enough to get a pneumonia vaccine and you can't remember having one, just talk to your primary care doctor and get that vaccination.
Right. There's not generally any harm. It's not a recommendation, but if, let's say you got a tetanus shot a year or two ago, you don't remember, you're not going to grow a tail if you get a tetanus booster today. Okay, well, I'm going to end it there. Vaccines are important. Everybody should go get their shots. And maybe even later today, Dr. Kus and Rakers and I will go get shots in honor of
spread love, not germs.
Spread love, not germs. What do you want to say, Dr. Kus?
Just one last thing. If you have any questions or any thoughts, find your doctor that you like. People call me all the time and ask me, should I really get the COVID vaccine? What do you think? And then get a doctor who you trust and let them walk you through it. If you have hesitations, if you have thoughts, there are answers. Don't sit in your cave and say, oh, the world is against me. Right. Find someone who's actually going to help you see the light.
Okay, I love that. That is a good piece of wisdom, Dr. Kus. Well, Health Explained listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to our vaccines podcast. We look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you so much for joining us. We will see you again next Thursday at 6 p.m.